Friends, welcome. It's great to have everybody here. My name is Sam Heath, and I'm with Equal Justice USA. And this is a webinar series we've been doing for about 3 years now. And it's called In the Movement because what we do is we want to engage and elevate the work and people who are in the justice movement. And that's defined really broadly. So I'm with Equal Justice USA. We're a national nonprofit, and we historically have done work around death penalty repeal and community safety. And this space, it's through the EJUSA Evangelical Network. It's a space that's open for anybody to come into and engage it, but it's a space that I think is especially important for Christians to come into to think about how do Christians live out their life and think about what justice is, especially as we think about things like mass incarceration. And we use that term here as a descriptor, but it's more of a symptom. We often talk about the criminal legal system and having at its root fear and control. And the result of that is that we have mass incarceration, this giant beast that gobbles people up and does all sorts of things. Wrapped up within that are how people think about violence and what we're looking at today. All of this is adjacent and really overlaps. But I'm going to be talking with a guest that I'm thankful and privileged to have met, to have read her book. But we're looking at the crossroads of religion and radicalization. So what we're going to do is we'll have a conversation for about the next hour or so. And I'm thankful that Angela Denker is here. She's written a couple books. The most recent one that we're going to talk about here is called Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. And we're going to talk about what all of those things mean. It's relevant at any point, but it feels what she's covered is increasingly relevant. So we're going to talk about that. And what we'll do is we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if anybody has any questions, you can put that in the chat. You can put that in the Q&A feature. You can click on that at the bottom. You're welcome to ask those as we go. And we'll save some time at the end for everybody to be able to ask those of Angela as we move towards the end of our time. And in just a second, Angela's going to introduce herself, but I'll put this in the chat. It's great to have and hear where everybody is from. So if you'd like, feel free to share your name, if you're from a church or an organization, and where you are. We'd love to see who all is here and listening. But Angela, thanks for being here. Excited to hear from you. And if you want to give a sentence or two of who you are and this work that you've come to, I have so much more that I want to ask, but just a teaser for who you are, and we'll kick it off that way.
Great. Well, I'm so glad to be here. So glad to have everybody here with us on this 4th of July week. Well, I know for me, especially in the years since I've been covering Christian nationalism, 4th of July carries this sort of extra weight to it where I'm trying to constantly weigh, what does it mean to be a faithful Christian on the 4th of July?
Mm,
So this conversation is very timely and really honored to be considered a part of the justice movement. It's I think it's easy for all of us to feel like the news coming out, the passage of this bill just yesterday, it feels really overwhelming and it feels like I'm never doing enough. I can't do enough. So I think gatherings like this are really, really important. So just a bit about me. I'm joining you all here from my home in Minneapolis. I have dual vocations, both as a Lutheran pastor. I've been ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America since 2013. I current I currently serve as pastor of visitation and public theology at Lake Nokomis Lutheran Church here in South Minneapolis. And then my other vocation, other than being a partner and a spouse and a mom and a daughter and all of the family and care vocations of my life, is as a journalist. And so I initially began my career as a sports writer. And I bring both of that to my work, to these books that I've written, to my ongoing work on Substack. I have a Substack called I'm Listening, where I'm really grappling with Christian nationalism and also this violent masculinity that's been coupled with Christian nationalism. Uh, we're really seeing it in the advent of Trump's second administration. And that's what I delve into in my second book, Disciples of White Jesus, which really almost serves as a second volume to my first book, Red State Christians.
right before we began, Angela and I were trading kid ages, and you just mentioned this, Angela, and I almost said it to you before we came on, but we too were thinking about continually, my wife and I, how do we narrate July 4th? And so we sat our kids down, as we have each year, to talk about Juneteenth, but this year we were really intentional about trying to compare and contrast those holidays and talk about what levels of freedom were in each, what overall and true and broader freedom looks like, really layered conversations. But those conversations in your book, it is all right there and proximate and into this justice work because so much of what your book is doing, I think, is storytelling, how we've gotten to where we are, and humanizing some of those pathways. So I'm so thankful for it. And I also told you before I listened to it. So it's a rare way that I engage nonfiction, but because it's story oriented, it draws you in a different way than a work of sociology or something might. Okay, let's start here because you mentioned this term. How do you talk through and conceive of Christian nationalism? Because there's so many definitions and there's lots out there. You know, people like Jamar Tisby write often and really well of this, and some have really set definitions. But that seems to be a common thread between both of your books. And so, when you talk about that, what do you mean?
Yeah, I love Jamar. We were blessed to be together on a panel in DC. So I do think my work
Right.
overlaps really well with work like folks like him, from a historical perspective, a racial justice perspective. Also folks like Kristen Dumay, and then the
Hmm.
sociological perspective, folks like Andrew Whitehead, Sam Perry. But I have come up with my own sort of lens definition to look at Christian nationalism. So
Great.
I'll read that for you
Great.
kind of break it down further. So, Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America, often rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s, before the civil rights movement or the women's movement. Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government and the imposition of fundamentalist. That's a key point here. We're talking not necessarily as much about conservative as we are about fundamentalist.
Mm-hmm.
So the imposition of a fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. It suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power, in contrast to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross, just as our crucified Savior did. So you can see I'm really looking at this through a lens of theology as a trained
Hmm.
theologian and a Lutheran pastor, and also looking at it through this lens a little bit of recent history and understanding the ways in which history and theology interact to bring about the violent takeover of Christian nationalism.
Okay, that is a robust definition, and we may need another webinar
Yes,
just for that.
yes, for sure.
If you're able to, if you're willing to send that out, that's something that we can send to everybody who's watching later because there's a lot to process. I love so much with it. Two things that stood out to me were the talking about the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. That contrast is so helpful, but also that you've used the language of idolatry. And I'm thinking about, great, I see it in the chat. I'll grab that and make sure we send that out. I love that you've given such a theological richness to it. It makes me think about when Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes talks about racism, and she says racism is a heresy. And
Mhm.
I love leading with that with Christians because we know racism is bad, but we often forget how it's heretical, how it's an overturning of the way that Jesus is sovereign. And Christian nationalism is in there doing that same idolatrous turn. So I love the richness of theology that's within that. What got you to feel it was really important to bring in the theology of the cross and talking about that as you talk about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, and I always tell people it's a really interesting origin story. So when I began research on my first book, Red State Christians, this was all the way back in 2017 when I was approached by a publisher. And a lot of our history now is funny, funny, ironic, not funny, haha. But the initial vision for this book, Red State Christians, was to take a Christian perspective similar to hillbilly elegy,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
we had no idea at that time that this darling of, the mainstream media, JD Vance, would be vice president to Trump in
Yeah.
2024. So just a commentary on how much things have shifted over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but anyway, so I was approached to write about this journey to Trump's first election and how Christians were involved. And so I had this really wonderful opportunity, especially in light of all the changes since COVID, in the year of 2018, to travel across the country, interviewing, researching, and spending time with Christians in red states and counties from Texas and Florida, Southern California to the Rust Belt, Appalachia, all the way up to New England to really understand and listen and report. Uh, and initially, when I was beginning this research back in 2017, I had no idea that Christian nationalism would be so much at the center of my research. This is before any of these other books have come out. This is before Christian nationalism has become a part of the national lexicon,
Mm-hmm.
and before conservatives have started to even embrace the term and put it on as a point of pride.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but so I first came about to learn about Christian nationalism actually from a Southern Baptist pastor named Dean and Sarah. And he was a member, he's now become sort of a vocal Trump supporter, and would maybe contest my version of this story. But he came to me when I was reporting at the March for Life and told me, as you do this research and write this book, you really need to focus on Christian nationalism because Christian nationalism has become, in his words, a gospel distortion
Mm.
within the Southern Baptist Convention. Uh, so, in his understanding, the gospel distortion means that Christian nationalism had become so powerful at this point in the SBC, this was back 2017, that it had begun to crowd out the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Mm.
And he was the one who told me, now, if you really want to understand Christian nationalism, you need to go to Prestonwood Baptist Church in Plano, Texas, over Fourth of July weekend. So that's where I went. That's how this began,
Wow.
and the theological perspective. I'm getting to your question. The theological perspective of theology of the cross versus theology of glory really comes out of my own Lutheran theological tradition. These are theological terms that are central to our understanding of faith. And it also comes from this deep appreciation and dwelling in the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer wrote extensively during his own time of resistance and of watching the rise of the Nazi Party and the
Mm.
ways that the Nazis used German Christian nationalism to funnel their ascent to power. And so that's where it came for me of this compulsion to really speak about Christian nationalism as as an idolatry
Right.
and as understanding this theology of glory, which when I say theology of glory, I also want people to think about prosperity gospel.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
That theology of glory is really analogous and lifts up many of the same ideologies around wealth, around power that we see in the prosperity gospel.
Yeah. There's so many fun overlaps I'm finding with our stories and some of the backgrounds I was going to talk about later, but I know you're from Minneapolis, which is very poignant in the story of race in the U.S. in the past few years. But also, I know so much of your book focused on Charleston and the Charleston shooting and the what that did and what that was. You talk about your connection with it. I'm in Charlottesville, and so obviously we had the Unite the Right rally in 2017, and a similar crash of people in a space both being wrecked by this moment of tragedy. And Strange Glory author Charles Marsh is a friend and former professor, so he was my foray into the Bonhoeffer world.
Yes.
So I see on the Amazon description, I don't know if this was actually in the book, was these two phrases: white boys and men are dangerous, white boys and men are struggling. How are you talking about both of those things being true and holding those together in grace and truth telling in both of those?
Yeah, I know that that first line is a polarizing one for a lot of people, and I just want
Yeah.
to know, like, I hold that close to myself as well. I'm married to a white man who I love dearly. I'm the mom of two white boys, so to say that they're dangerous
Mm-hmm.
is a provocative and a statement that none of us loves to make, right, about anybody. But these two statements about dangerous and struggling comes from two statistics that I held really close as I began the research from this book. The first one is that white men are more likely than any other demographic group to be the perpetrator of a mass shooting. We just have sadly here in Minneapolis seen the role of Christian nationalism in radicalization of the shooter who tragically took the life of former Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark in the suburb, right next door to where I grew up, where my parents live. So it's so close to home. So there's that statement, there's that statistic about mass shootings. And then the other statistic is that white men are more likely than any other demographic group to die by suicide. And we see those rates continuing to rise. I just saw some new statistics that came out last week around suicide and the ways that it impacts different demographic groups. So I think it's important to address both sides.
Hmm.
Historically, and even in recent years, when people want to talk about masculinity, stereotypically, people think, well, leftist groups want to quote unquote demonize men and boys and say that
Hmm.
they're only the problem.
Hmm.
And then from the right wing, we tend to have a lot of more sympathy around what's happening for men and boys, maybe an educational output as we see them lagging. But there's less of a willingness to acknowledge that the danger they also pose in violence. So I think it's important to hold both of these truths in tension. And I was really well placed to do that, both as a researcher and a pastor, as someone who has experienced sexism in the church and as a sports writer in male dominated professions, but also as someone who's the mom of white boys and watching them grow up and desperately wanting better for them.
Yeah. What was it like researching and writing on this, which I know is a process of a while, as you are raising your boys and seeing them experience some of these things? How much did it maybe reveal to you? How much did it shape how you and your partner parent? Just what effect did that have on you?
Yeah, it was huge. I begin the book even thinking back to this conversation that I was having with a group of other basketball moms at a hotel in Iowa, and we're each talking about our boys. And at that time, I think they were all 10. Um, and they're coming of age, they're growing into men, many of them on this team, being basketball players. They're tall for their age, they're strong, they're out there, they're athletic. And then as moms, we still see also their deep vulnerability. We see them struggling to process emotions. We see the impact of this social conditioning that has long existed in America for boys and men, that the only acceptable emotion is anger. Um, and so we were talking about that, and it just struck me how aware we were of their vulnerabilities and how close their vulnerability was to us. And yet at the same time, we're living at a time of increased radicalization. We're living at a time when many of these same boys on their YouTube accounts are getting fed content like Andrew Tate, content that is deeply violent towards women, content that is deeply racist, content that is suggesting that the only way to become a man is to have big muscles and to turn off your emotions and to not trust women and see women as something dangerous. So it's really, in some ways, as I'm sure you can relate to, it's a hard time to be a parent. You're up against these very profitable algorithms that are impacting our kids day in and day out. It's kind of like being a parish pastor where people are getting cable news all week long, and you
Mm,
have like 1 hour, to maybe try and de-radicalize during worship or give a different vision of Jesus
yeah.
than the pop culture Jesus.
Yeah.
So it's tough, but it's important. I think we can't diminish the importance of these grassroots methods of de-radicalization, whether it is in the local church or in families, and not
Yeah.
just parents, aunts, uncles,
Yeah.
close family friends, coaches, teachers. I I'm sure many folks who are on this webinar are in that role of influence for young people, and it's just so important.
Yeah, yeah. It takes such a high degree of accompaniment. I recently have been trying to talk to my son, he's 8, about anger. And if I don't know if he understands what I'm saying, but I try to keep repeating him so he hears it, that anger is always a secondary emotion. Like, let's get at what's really under it. And in my line of sight is our feelings wheel that we have framed strategically by our oldest daughter's door. But so that we have this language other than it just being either anger or, like you said, shutting it down. You talk at one point in the book, and I'd love to hear more about this, about how boys and men need a quote, permission to feel. What does that mean? Why is that a really poignant phrase and concept for where we are in culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I want to acknowledge too that, for some of us, including me, when you first say that phrase, like, oh, boys and men need permission to feel, it's like, gosh, what more can we do to coddle them? Like they've got all the, if you look at
Mm,
positions of power, positions of wealth in
yeah,
the world, in the country, it is still predominantly white men. So I
yeah.
think that it's an important initial conversation to even say, why are we talking about this when we do still live in an age where white men and boys have many more privileges than others? And so I think a good way to get at that too, and this to understand why this permission to feel is important, is that I want to say that even for those men who reach sort of the heights of what this movement would be considered the ultimate success stories. So look at, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, top level of wealth and power. Even for people who would say, yeah, I'm on board, I'm supportive of these folks, I think you'd be really hard pressed to say at the same time. And those are the role models for father
Hmm.
that I
Hmm.
want for my young boys.
Hmm.
Um, in the church, there's a long held saying that says you'll know them by their fruit. And the fruits of this movement, even again, when it achieves what it says are its most precious goals of wealth, of power, of influence, all we see is this carnage of broken relationships, of pain, of families that have been torn apart. And so, this permission to feel, I think when you look at, again, a lot of these men who have ascended to the heights of power and influence, it's a very thin veneer
Hmm.
of sort of confidence, preening, projection,
Right.
covering over this real deeply seated sense of male insecurity. And male
Yeah.
insecurity, if we look back throughout history, somebody like
I
Napoleon.
was gonna say it was the first person I thought of.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, we have a lot of examples.
yeah.
Male insecurity is the ends up leading to a lot of violence,
Hmm.
and it ends up leading to a lot of destruction. It ends up leading to war.
Yeah,
If we look at
yeah,
somebody like Vladimir Putin, who is and Netanyahu, world leaders who are so desperate to maintain their own personal sense of security and power that they're willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands of soldiers, millions of people,
yeah,
in order to hold on to power. That's a real reason to say, let's address this root cause. Let's
yeah,
understand what's happening at the beginning, in order so that we don't end up with this sense of insecurity and anger driving national and international policy and
yeah.
risking and threatening so many people's lives and well-being.
Yeah. And it's an in-house discussion too within the Christian community. I mean, you did not mince words in talking about Mark Driscoll and his journey within the book. And for those who want to hear more, read the book, but also Jesus and John Wayne and Christianity Today's Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church. But that's such a hard story and example to see and hear because it was something that was so public. And I think it emphasizes one word and a phrase that you repeat a lot in the book, the word being Christian. But you talk a lot about young white Christian men and boys. And I feel like each of those 5 words is kind of getting a lens closer and closer on the target group that you're looking at. So I feel you talked a good bit about the young and the white and the men and boys piece. You gave some of those statistics, but what got you kind of to add in the Christian piece of this that was unique of what this looks like within the Christian church?
Well, first of all, it is my area of expertise as a theologian, as a pastor. It's so central to all of this. As I say, this movement is rooted in idolatry, it's rooted in a theology, and
Mm.
it's rooted in how people understand God. This
Hmm.
view that so many people, even people who don't go to church, who wouldn't say they're very religious, so many of us reflexively have in our mind this image of God as an old, angry white man.
Yeah, with the
Uh,
beard. Yeah,
yes, yes. And
yeah.
that image, a beard, yes. And now we see all these, disciples of white Jesus within my book, leaning into that same aesthetic. Um, I like your
The
beard
beard
though, Sam.
culture. Yes.
Uh, so anyway, when we're talking about the Christian lens specifically, one thing that I think is hindering our ability to really understand this movement as Americans is that we have a national press and national media that's really hesitant to talk about religion.
Mm.
So the ways that Christianity is covered is so often as a spectacle. Like,
Mm. Hmm.
wow, look at how crazy this pastor is or this church is. Um,
Yeah.
that does, it is enables the majority of the American public, many of whom are Christians, to say, well, I'm nothing like that. That has nothing to do with me. And it hinders us from understanding, especially those of us who are white Christians. It hinders us from understanding how the roots of our own churches, our own theology, is also implicated within this movement towards violence, towards a masculinity that's really reductive, and towards understanding Jesus through this lens that has nothing to do with Jesus of the Bible, but
Hmm.
instead has to do with this character of white Jesus that we've created in order to excuse our own thirst for power and for control and for violence.
Yeah. And I think excuse is really the right word for it. I mean, we talked about Jamar, who, when I saw he endorsed your book, that's what for sure locked me in. He's a dear friend, and I've come under his teaching for many, many years. Um, in his book, The Color of Compromise, in the subtitle is that word complicit. And he talks so much about the complicity of the Christian church within white supremacy in the US. I'm also thinking about Michael Emerson's book, The Religion of Whiteness, and how he will come out and say, we're not just talking about Christian nationalism. There's a whole religion of whiteness that is sociologically tangible, that this is such a big piece of, and then it's not just a subculture within this. So people are talking about the scope and scale of it, and especially what it looks like within the church, and it seems to be so much more than just a complicity. There's something that's so threaded in. But then you also talk about identity often in the book. And you talk about the root of violence being based in a misshapen identity. And so that kind of takes it from this religion level, is it endemic, the complicity, really down to an individual person. So I'd love to hear you riff on identity because so often in my work, I love storytelling all of the damning stats about the criminal legal system because they're easy and there's so many, but often that doesn't convince people, which isn't really the goal. What really convinces them is drawing them into an identity of beauty, one of imagination. And so that identity lane really is what we know draws people and changes hearts. And so hearing you talk about the root cause and the violence being identity, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, and that's why I think that really reclaiming the true identity of Jesus, of the historical Jesus, as someone who A was not American, B was not white, C was someone who had deep friendships and relationships with women and trusted
Hmm.
women to proclaim the gospel. That's so central to fighting back against this movement. So that identity piece of Jesus and reclaiming Jesus' true identity that we see evidence throughout the Bible is really important, and so central to my work, both as a pastor and as a journalist. Uh, and also, I've been curious about the role of identity formation and how we're forming identity in the US for a long time now, beginning with the work that I did in Red State Christians. And one of the first things that I noticed in some of the data that I paid attention to was this data that was noting the declining importance of religious or denominational identity for
Mm,
Americans, and the increasing importance of partisan identity.
mm,
Um, that
mhm,
it became much more important for people to identify as a Republican or as a Democrat. And it was much less important, if we look back generations ago, people's identity would be much more wrapped up in what church do you go to?
right.
And there are still certain places around America where that's an important marker. But increasingly, partisanship has eclipsed religious identity. And I think that, alongside that decline of the local church, the decline of community organizations, the decline of, and then we had COVID, which sort of set all that into
Yeah.
hyperspeed.
Yeah.
Um, we really got to a place where people's identity formation is now happening, especially for young people and kids and teenagers, online. That identity is being formed online. And one of the big problems with that is that the internet primarily does not see you as a human being, but instead as a consumer and as a
Mm,
as a checkbook.
yeah.
Um, and so as we've seen, these platforms are going to do whatever it takes to just keep you on them. And the number one way to keep people on them is to introduce increasingly radicalized content. Uh, and it's not an equal distribution left and right. It's really the right-wing radical content that is being prioritized and pushed by these algorithms, by these platforms,
Hmm.
because it's the most, it's does the best job of keeping people online. So this identity formation that's happening online, that's being driven not by, this community sense of how do we form identity that's going to keep our community together, that's going to lift up relationally solid individuals, people that are going to be caregivers and providers. Instead, the identity formation that's happening online is primarily interested in individuals as sucking as much profit as they can out of them.
Right. Yeah.
And so you end up with people in deep debt from what they've bought online. You have people who are constantly frantic about how do I chase this next big thing that I need to purchase or participate in so that I might be part of a community that I'd like to align with. Uh, it's really a huge problem, as you can see. And
Hmm.
what I write about with men and boys and what's happening with this fundamentalist religious indoctrination is happening also to girls with the trad wife movement that's become really popular online. It's really a comprehensive problem that's going to take a long time and a lot of targeted efforts to push back on.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I think about the documentary, The Social Dilemma. It's a little dated, but I remember a piece of it being this fictional portrayal of what's happening within our brains when we engage social media. But what it emphasizes was just what you were saying of this individual is a consumer, and our job is to do whatever we can to continue to have that person engage whatever that platform is, and that shapes someone's identity without even saying you're a consumer. It's leading them into that practice. And we can James K. Smith all of it. There's this whole liturgy that we go through with our bodies, and then
Yeah.
an identity will often flow from that. And as you said earlier, it takes such I want to use the word combating, but I would rather use the word spiritual formation to work against that. I
Mhm.
just earlier today drafted and scheduled my July 4th email to go out to our network through Equal Justice USA and was talking about something that you said that really made me think about it of how the Christian story is who we are for, how we are loving, who we are bringing in, and we see Jesus, of course, embodying that. But so much of the tribalism right now is who we are against. Whom can we push against? What is it that who are we trying to malign? And some of that shift I feel is what you're getting at sociologically of that identity often being rooted in a church, now shifting to a political party. And that change in identity, we're seeing now the effects of that all over.
And let me say too, it's even shifted. I've seen like from my first book to my second book, when we saw partisan identity becoming really important, that has been subjugated now. in many ways, what I'm seeing by personal allegiance to Donald Trump himself,
Yeah,
rather
that's
than
an
the
important
Republican
nuance. Yeah.
Party. So, and I'm seeing that shift along with this increased alignment towards a specific kind of masculinity. And I also saw that shift really increase last summer with the assassination attempts on Trump and the ways that we saw a lot of sort of influencers and imagery spring up, suggesting that Trump had been spared for some sort of messianic mission.
Right.
Um, all of that. So I just think that's
Right.
another important point that I want to sort of look at as we look at identity formation and how people's identities are being formed now, not so much around a political party, but instead around adherence more to an individual.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think about a dear friend of mine who's also a pastor. He leads the group Conservatives Concerned, and they do a lot of work against the death penalty. And
Mm,
his name's, if I didn't say, Demetrius. And he is very much, he will say, I'm a lifelong conservative, but I can take or leave the Republican Party. And I think of that now that, Donald Trump very much doesn't conform to a typical Republican candidate or to conservative values, but yet he's an identity, he's a persona. And you're right that there's been such a shift in loyalty that has surrounded him. I also love my favorite Demetrius quote was at the Christian Community Development Association a few years ago, and he said, and this was radical for him, and I loved it. He said, "There's no American flag in heaven," which fits
mm,
with our Christian nationalism
mm.
discussion. But sometimes we need those reminders because we're seeing such an overturning of that. But you're right, especially situated around Donald Trump.
Mhm.
So you've talked a bit about right-wing Christianity, but you also said that you were really careful to name and label that you're looking at the fundamentalist piece of it. So how are you defining and really locating and in a productive way, kind of finger pointing the fundamentalist branch rather than Christianity as a whole?
Yeah, and I think how we use words is kind of under attack right now, right?
Mm,
That people are using the same words to mean very different things, and oftentimes people are is pointing out something wrong in someone else that they're actually identifying within themselves.
hmm
Um,
hmm
so we're in this time where it's really important to be clear about definitions and to be clear about what words mean. So I think two of those words, liberal and conservative, have been so misused to almost be meaningless now.
Yeah.
The root idea of what it means to be a political conservative is to be cautious, is to not be looking to, so there's this movement to tamp down social change. Um, but it does not have, and we even see this with the Supreme Court, where this supposedly movement to have a conservative Supreme Court has become an activist Supreme Court in many ways, in the ways that it's been overturning precedent, in the ways that it has been looking to make it easier for a head executive to make policy changes. So, overturning this historic separation of power and the need for Congress, the courts, and the president to work in conjunction with one another. So, fundamentalism is really important to understand that fundamentalists share more in common with one another across religious lines than they do with folks of their own religion.
Mm-hmm.
So, a fundamentalist Christian is going to have more in common with a fundamentalist Muslim, a fundamentalist Jew, a fundamentalist Hindu than they will have in common with a progressive Christian. And you really see this when it comes to gender, which is why I really saw it in my reporting around Disciples of White Jesus. Specifically, that one of the hallmarks of fundamentalism is its strict adherence to very, very uh, restrictive gender rules. So we've seen, in a, again, sort of a funny, not necessarily haha, but funny and just outlandish example of this. There's so much being written, so much space and theology and conversation devoted not just to women's dress and how women dress within right-wing Christian spaces, but even to specific things like leggings and
Mm-hmm.
how leggings are supposedly a tool of the devil.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much policing around, women's role in society. We see this with sort of the transgender panic that's been introduced, especially leading up to the 2024 presidential election. Uh, and we really see it when it comes to sort of the homogenization of what women should look like
Hmm.
within, when you look at the MAGA movement, you look at the women of MAGA. It's interesting because it's much more hypersexualized than you might anticipate from a conservative Christian viewpoint. But from a fundamentalist viewpoint, it works in that it's all in the same box and it's all really geared not towards how women might personally choose to dress, but really geared towards the male gaze,
Hmm.
specifically towards the preferences of Donald Trump.
Hmm. So how if fundamentalism can transcend religion, which is so important to think about, how do you define a fundamentalist beyond just Christian fundamentalist?
Yeah, I think it's really just this lack of space for nuance.
Mm,
It's really just an insistence on yes or no, black or white answers. There was a really interesting study that shared by Ryan Burge, who's a fantastic religion data scientist, and he was talking about how different religious groups in the U.S. understand doubt. And the a fundamentalist would say that there is absolutely no space for doubt, even though as Jesus ascends in Matthew 28 and his disciples gather, this is the same text that's used for the Great Commission. Uh, it tells us his disciples came and they worshiped him, but some doubted. But in fundamentalism, there's no space for that. Everything is very clearly defined and divided. So
mhm.
there's separate spheres for women, there's separate spheres for men. Uh, and there's also the common thing is too, which is in contrast with Orthodox Christian theology. And Kristen DeMay mentions this in her book. We believe in a Trinity. We believe in a God representative one God, three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or however different names you want to give to the Trinity. Fundamentalism insists upon one solitary authoritarian God. And that one solitary, all powerful figure really lends itself to the ways in which fundamentalism is often paired with political authoritarianism and
Mhm.
fascism.
Mhm. Mm. I I don't know if I'd thought through all the way to the end of the insistence of some anti-Trinitarian theology with the insistence of this authoritarian God. That's really really helpful. I think that would rattle people if you spelled it out like that to say you're holding a view of the Trinity that is not biblical in those
Yes.
terms. Similar to Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes just giving that theological frame to racism.
Yeah.
So you also talk in the book about American boys being taught about race with a shame frame
Mhm.
that it often comes that way, and you contrast it with a frame that's one of truth telling.
Mhm.
How do you teach truth without shaming, especially as we think about race and masculinity and how we're talking about the identity of American men and boys?
Well, I think this goes back to something we were talking about earlier, where I was saying that there is this desire on the part of many white American Christians to distance ourselves from
Hmm.
racism and to say, well, this is somebody
Hmm.
else's problem. And so another way that white Americans have done this is by teaching and understanding racism specifically through an individual lens. So this pointing out of saying that person is racist.
Mm.
And we can tell they're racist because of how they dress. We can tell they're racist because of the words they use. Rather than looking at historical trends and policies like here in, northern, supposedly liberal Minneapolis, we have this historical evidence of redlining where Black Americans and also Jews could not buy houses in certain neighborhoods. That's a great example of a way to teach the legacy and history of racism without shame, because these are
Hmm.
policies, these are systems that were instituted together by people who may have been, for all appearances, industrious, hardworking, honest, certainly successful,
Hmm.
overwhelmingly white men who instituted many of the policies that have made America what it is today. But along so doing, they instituted a structuralized system of racism. And I think what we're seeing right now, indisputably, when it comes to immigration policy, is this last gasp attempt to
Mm,
re-systematize a sort of caste system in America,
mm,
this new desire and this retrograde desire to hold on to the racist power structure. And it's no coincidence that this was all sort of ginned up and really intensified after the election of Barack Obama.
mm. I have behind me Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast, and just that term, if I didn't already use the word, but it's a really poignant way to label what's happening. I'm also reeling from Jim Ryan, our president at UVA here in Charlottesville, resigned and stepped down under pressure from the Trump administration around DI efforts and all sorts of things. And we've had some ICE agents in town arrest some people at a courthouse, and there have been a lot of localized manifestations of a lot of these things, but I appreciate you framing it within this lens of we're trying to kind of re-up something. It's a last gasp, and I think you're right in it kind of being a last gasp. Like there's a desperation ethos to it, which makes it no less harmful, but hopefully makes it less sustainable over time. It is my hope and prayer.
Yeah, I think it in some ways it makes it more harmful because it's desperate and so there's
Mm,
no holds barred anymore, you know?
yeah, yeah,
There's no worries about keeping up appearances.
yeah.
And I've been saying this is last gasp for I mean, I've been saying this is a last gasp effort for a while and it keeps gaining oxygen and
It's
strength. So
gasping. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of us who have been, okay, let's look a little deeper. Let's look a little deeper. Where is this still growing? Where is this still entrenching? And I do think a lot of it is, you know, this movement is very skilled at calling out true places of injustice, whether it's
Hmm.
been, corruption within government, whether it's been political party dysfunction. All of those things have been true. It's just that the solutions that they've offered have only retrenched those problems in a deeper
Hmm.
way.
Mm. My family is just back from our beach week, and we referenced countless times the movie Barbie and how we were beaching and having a great time doing all of those things. And we also
Mm.
talked a little earlier, just kind of laughing at or saying, oh, another way to kind of coddle white men and boys. But yet there's such a vulnerability that's there that's often not allowed. And so I want to ask too, what role in all of this does loneliness play? Because you talk about that a bit, and loneliness is less an emotion and more like just this state of being that someone is in, but especially for white men and boys, isn't one that I think is often expected and certainly isn't one that is acknowledged, but that's wrapped up in the malformed identity. How so?
Yeah, we have, I think it was the outgoing Surgeon General who wrote about this often, Vivek Murthy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yes, the loneliness epidemic. It's affecting all of us. I think one of the elements that lends it to really intensively affecting white Christian boys and men is because while all of America is impacted by these messages about gender roles, about expectations for men and women, those expectations are heightened specifically, especially when we see the growth of private schools that are teaching these principles, the growth of homeschooling, and so what you have is this teaching that is no longer compatible with economic realities. So we're telling white men and boys, your greatest source of identity and strength is as a financial provider. That you are supposed to provide for your family, you're supposed to be strong and silent. We're throwing them out then into an economy that really requires a two-payer household
Hmm.
and a two full-time working adult requirement. And even in that, in many US cities, is no longer enough to afford
Hmm.
rent or to afford a mortgage. Um, but when you have these men who and women who've been told, hey, women don't work, men go out and they earn a living, and then they go out and they can't do it. And it's not feasible. It's
Hmm.
not sustainable. They don't have both the outer conditions or the internal conditions. Maybe they're called more into caregiving. Maybe their personality lends itself more to being a secondary income earner and not a primary wage earner. Whatever it is, it leads them to this place of feeling like I have completely failed. I
Hmm.
have become some sort of disappointment and traitor to my gender, to my religion, to my community. And this sense of loneliness comes from this idea that they're seeing on social media, they're hearing in their congregations that I'm the only one who can't do it
Right.
because Jesus said we're supposed to do it. And somehow, not only have I failed, but somehow maybe I have not been a good Christian if I can't do this.
Hmm.
So we've really set up a lot of folks for a crisis situation. And what I really am concerned about now is the kids who are being brought up in those kind of situations and who are then having to face the fallout of marriages that are struggling because of these economic and social realities. And also kids who are maybe vulnerable to abuse in a situation where parents are experiencing deep loneliness, they're disconnected
Hmm.
from community. That's something I'm really concerned about right now.
Hmm. And as you said earlier, COVID really
Yeah.
blew that up, and
Yeah.
we're still feeling so many of those effects. One, maybe one final question as we move towards wrapping up. What is your hope for individual Christians and churches as they engage the work, specifically Disciples of White Jesus? What is your hope that they would come away with, either thinking or doing differently?
Yeah, I think what I hear a lot of times, and I do a lot of presentations for churches and for church leader groups, the compliment that I like hearing the most is that people come out of it feeling empowered because they
Mm,
have this new sense of understanding of the connections. So between all of these different things, and they have some sort of
mm,
framework to understand it both theologically and historically, as well as spiritually. So I think that that's a really important first step to see how all these seemingly disparate trends are connected, and then also that they have some sense for this isn't the only available narrative around masculinity. Jesus offers a totally different and much more hopeful narrative about masculinity. And not only the example of Jesus, but what I see when I give presentations a lot of times is there are white men in the audience who also will say, I grew up with a different narrative around masculinity. You know,
mm,
I have a different example to share of what I'm doing in my life. And instead of these men feeling like, well, I have nothing to contribute because I wasn't brought up in this John Wayne masculinity sense, instead helping them to feel, hey, my story has value, my story is really important, and
mm,
my narrative has a role in turning back the tide.
mm, mm. I'm so appreciative of the way that you center identity and the way that you center theology and all of these parts and pieces within all of it. And that definition of Christian nationalism, I really want to sit with and work my way through more and hold it not up against not against, but with Jamar's, which is a kind of a historical sociological one, because there's such a richness in how you're digging into it theologically. So we'll start to move out and close out, and I want to make sure people have a way to continue on with you and your work. I'll put a couple things in the chat. First is if people don't already, please feel free to follow the Evangelical Network on Facebook to hear about more conversations like this, other resources like this. I'll also send all of this out to people in an email. I'll send out the recording too. But make sure to look at Angela's site. There's her Substack as well. You can keep up with where she is, what she's writing on, and also check out Red State Christians. And I love how you talked about how those books really work in tandem, and that Disciples of White Jesus continues that discussion that began in Red State Christians. Can I ask, kind of where are you thinking, and what are you looking at in the future? Kind of where does all of this take you in your mind next?
Yeah, I feel like I'm hearing this more and more among authors who are covering Christian nationalism, so I may not be unique, but I'm kind of playing around with a potential novel that's looking at
Mm,
some of these trends and investigating it through the story of a few different individuals here in the upper Midwest. So I'm hopeful about that idea. I think
okay.
that for some people, a nonfiction book on Christian nationalism feels really daunting and they're not going to pick it up. So I'm hoping to broaden the understanding of folks with potentially offering sort of a fictionalized perspective that might bring in some more people. So we'll see.
Okay. That's great. Well, don't undersell Disciples of White Jesus because it's so story oriented.
Yeah.
And it's not just your stories, it's
Yeah.
you processing those, but the people that you encounter, especially as you look at Charleston and
Yes.
the Emmanuel shooting, and we're at the
Yes.
10-year anniversary of that. I think it was yesterday that Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mother was one of the nine who was killed,
Mm-hmm.
put out yet another op-ed about her
Mm-hmm.
opposition to the death
Yeah.
penalty and her hope for Dylan Roof not to die. She's furious
Yeah.
with him and angry
Yeah.
and upset, but it was a multi-year journey though of her moving to a place of I can release him from this and don't want to pursue
Mm-hmm.
this thing. All of
Mm-hmm.
that swirls together. And again, I really love how you were talking about all of these discussions actually overlap. And I think what you're saying without saying, and maybe you did, is the theology of Jesus and who he is pulls these threads together. And without that lens, we're really missing the connection of all of these pieces. And so your book really is at the crossroads of a lot of different discussions right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to put one more thing in the chat before we finish here, because I know that there's a lot of folks in your organization who are working in criminal justice reform and against the death penalty. I spent some time in a prison here in Minnesota and did some deep
Mm,
reporting on a chaplaincy program that's happening there.
okay.
So I just want to direct folks to that column as well. I write columns for the Minnesota Star Tribune, and that's another place to
Great.
my
Thank
writing is.
you. Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
I'll make sure to have that in the email as well. Yeah. Thank you for coming, for sharing of this. It's a really vulnerable thing to talk about your work and your writing, especially when you situate it with your husband and your boys, all of whom are white, as you're
Yeah.
processing this. And I know that's been a journey. So thank you for the vulnerability in that and being willing to continue all of this and provoke thought and action in different ways. So thank you. Thank you. You are in the justice movement, Angela, very much. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming. We'll send out the recording for this really soon in the resources. Thanks for joining. Bye
Thanks.
bye.